Hi there. Welcome back, everyone, to the community of practice for our evaluation group. I can see a few of you now joining us here on the line. We actually had 35 people registered from the evaluation community of practice to join us on the webinar today. Thank you for being here. My name is Kirsty, and I'm Tamarac's Engagement Community Animator. I hope you all enjoyed a really nice break in December and that your new year is off to a fantastic start. For today's call, I'm just going to start with a brief overview of how the agenda is going to play out. First, we're going to move into check-ins from the group. Because we're doing the format today as a webinar, you are automatically muted when you join the call. So what we're asking you to do, instead of the usual way where we unmute the lines and let you check in verbally, we're asking that you please type your check-in into the chat box in your go-to control panel. Let us know who you are, where you're calling in from. Let us know about any evaluation work updates you might have. And in particular, let us know what brought you to the call today. We'd love to know more about that. So we'll let you kind of go through your check-ins through the chat box there, and we'll look into that a little bit later. And I'll then introduce our guest speakers, Anshula, Chowdhury, and Kate Ruff, who will be presenting a slideshow about lessons learned and key outcomes from the recent Social Impact Analyst Association conference, which took place in November in Toronto. For the sake of today's presentation, you'll have the option to both type your questions into the chat box during the presentation for our presenters to speak to, and we'll also have a dedicated time for questions at the end of the presentation. And then we'll end the call with a few announcements as per usual before the hour is up at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So I see we've got about 18 people on the line now. Lovely seeing some of you checking in through the chat box. Please go ahead and let us know what brought you to the call today. And we'll send out actually a list of the check-ins in our follow-up email after the call. We'll send out the recording, some resources related to the call today, along with your check-ins. So I'm just going to move in now to our speaker bios, tell you a little bit about Kate and Anshula. And Kate, if you would like to move to the next slide, that would be great. So Kate Ruff researches how charities measure and report their social results, focusing on issues of materiality, reporting formats, and the role of analysts in the measurement ecosystem. Prior to returning to academia, Kate held social impact analyst positions with Charity Intelligence Canada, CECI Nepal, Social Enterprise London in the UK, and the United Way of Greater Toronto. Kate has a BCom from McGill University, an MSc from the London School of Economics, and she is currently completing her PhD at Schulich School of Business at York University. She serves on the board of Social Value Canada and Social Value International, and was the Director of Programming for the 4th Annual International Social Impact Analyst Conference in Toronto. And Anshula Chowdhury, our second guest speaker, founded Social Asset Measurements, SAM, developing the industry-leading Social Return Intelligence Suite, which provides social return on investment and impact measurement reporting. SAM has been twice funded by the National Research Council of Canada. Anshula is a co-founder and board member of the Youth Social Innovation Capital Fund and the Social Impact Analyst Association Canada. Her international experiences span the nonprofit and for-profit sectors in various countries, such as Jamaica and India. She has guest lectured at the Schulich School of Business, the Ivey School of Business, OCAD University's Masters of Foresight and Strategic Innovation, and various conferences throughout Canada, the States, and Europe. So Anshula and Kate, we're very pleased to have you participating in today's community of practice call. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll give people you can check in through the questions box as we go along. But I think Anshula and Kate, if you're ready, we can get the presentation started.
Great, thank you for that, Kirsty. So we're very excited to be on this call today. As Kirsty mentioned, we had started, Kate and I actually were the co-chairs for the 4th Annual Social Impact Analyst Association Conference. The reason that this was something that we wanted to be part of was that this is the first time the conference is actually taking place outside of Europe. SIAA is the international body that discusses emerging principles and practices for impact analysis, and generally it's been, most of the activities have taken place in Europe. We started SIAA Canada last year, and were given the opportunity, 2 years ago, we were given the opportunity to host a conference here in Toronto, actually in the same week as the Social Finance Forum, and shortly thereafter, as probably many of you are aware, there was also the Community Knowledge Exchange Conference hosted by OTF. So a really exciting and packed November, the SIAA conference being one of those events. And so as we brought forward this audience, Kate, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, we started to consider who would actually be coming to the Impact Analyst Conference. And one of the major questions that often comes up is, how is Impact Analysts or analysis very different from evaluators, accountants, economists, and consultants? And what we started to realize was that impact analysis is an emerging profession that really blends and is the confluence of several different areas of work that have a long history. So the Impact Analyst Conference was unique in that there were consultants that had accounting experience, were traditional evaluators. We had Benoit Gauthier from the Canadian Evaluation Society also attend and actually speak at the conference. But we also had people who came from much more traditional economic backgrounds, and the work that is being done here is pulling from all of these separate disciplines and bringing forward a new way to look at essentially the external impacts of an organization, whether that's a nonprofit or government, and in some cases corporations. Kate, did you have anything to add?
No, that's great, Anshula. Thank you. So I'm going to take over here and talk a little bit about some elements of talking data. As Christy mentioned, I was responsible for developing the program for the conference. And while I did have a committee that helped me, and I offered them a number of options, probably because I did the best job animating and elaborating the topic that most closely aligns with my own research, it turned out that the conference and my own personal research interests were very closely aligned. So not entirely by intention, but nor entirely by coincidence. So the theme was talking data, and the key point here is that it's about more than measuring and putting the data to good use. So what we're looking at in this conference is what happens kind of after the evaluation is done, after the measures are measured, after the analysis has been done. How are we going to make sure that the hard work we put into that all that's been done up to that point then goes on to have impact itself? And people understood this in two different ways in the conference, which actually was interesting to me, because I had envisioned the first way, which is what I mostly pay attention to, which is understanding the different ways that we communicate data and how that affects how stakeholders interact with the organization, how we can shape the interaction of stakeholders through our communications. What came from the conference, which I found really exciting, and Anshula's going to speak more to this in a bit, is getting the data itself to talk to each other so that we are amalgamating organization or project level data into something that means more or is bigger than that. So I'm going to speak to the first few points, and I look forward to taking your questions at the end. Our keynote speaker on the first day was a woman named Trina Chasen. She's very, very young. She's a computer programmer, but she's developing kind of a cult following for her ability to talk about data visualization. The image on the right is a screen capture from her online book. It is completely free. It was written by her and a bunch of colleagues, and it talks about how to do data visualization. So if this is something you're interested in doing, the link will be attached to the slides that get sent out, or you can simply Google the phrases you see on the screen. Chapters 14 to 17 or something are really about best practices in data visualization, how to do data visualization, why to do data visualization, etc. The first 13 or so chapters are more on how to gather and clean data. So if you're a qualitative person, you might find it interesting. Otherwise, glaze over it. Trina's key point, which I found really interesting, is that people interact differently with the same data depending on how it's presented. She focuses on quantitative data. I tend to focus on both data as both qualitative and quantitative, but her talk was about getting numbers to tell a story in a way that tables of numbers or spreadsheets of numbers can't. The image on the left is an image that Trina presented, and I've since spent a bit more time researching. You all might be familiar with it. This is a picture that Florence Nightingale drew about the British Army in India and causes of death per 1,000 in India. The different colors represent different causes of death, and she was able to use this diagram to advocate for the role of better sanitation in improving soldiers' health outcomes. Trina claims it is one of the first data visualizations created. I think what's key about this visualization, that if we're looking for key takeaways from the conference, is that it's visualizing a whole data set. I'm going to show some other examples. I tried to find some good examples of data visualization in the social reporting, and I think it is very telling that I couldn't find any. But I did find this from something called 17 Best Data Visualizations in the Nonprofit Sector. And this is an infographic. I think this is an example of what we're not talking about. This is not where we're trying to go. So what often happens when we talk about data visualization is making little bits of data look pretty. And that's what this chart has done. So you just look around, there's little bits of numbers here and there, and they're little factoids that have been well decorated. Whereas if this data here that Florence Nightingale has is a whole data set. The other thing we think about when we think about combining data and stories that often happens in reports is something like this, where on the left you have the story that engages our stakeholders, in this case probably our targeted donors, from a particular individual case study, a quote from the participant, and then on the right a whole bunch of numbers to perhaps deepen or collaborate the story. But again, the numbers themselves aren't telling the story. They are sort of the hard, sober accompaniment to a story. This is an example I found while looking for examples of good data visualizations. As I said, I think it's telling that I don't think any strong examples came out of the conference, so we've got a long way to go in this area. But this is an example that I found from the American Evaluation Society's Data Visualization Group. The link to that blog is also in the notes to the presentation and will be sent around after the presentation. What this diagram does is illustrate the movement of money through an organization. I think this is called a Scanta diagram. I will look that up for you in a second. But it visualizes flows of material resources. It could be people, it could be money, it could be supplies for emergency relief, something like that. What is the two key things that I think in this illustrate what Trina was talking about in her keynote is that it captures a whole spreadsheet. I mean, the amount of data that is behind this particular picture is immense. It's not a single factoid. It's not 9 out of 10 people achieved this goal and you've got 10 little stickmen and 9 colored in. We're adding through visualization our ability to engage with the data and have the data speak to the user. So for me, when I look at this diagram, I think, why are the bars of different widths and what are the different colors and what does this mean and why do things go from all the way from here to there? The organization that commissioned this result, I think it was a government body in Idaho, has since found that this diagram and way of representing their monetary flow is so useful, and it's so much better at engaging their employees and other stakeholders and understanding the organization that they've completely stopped spreadsheets and conventional accounting tables and moved into using this because it fosters a conversation engagement that tables of numbers can't. So if I had to pick the key takeaway from our first keynote and our first day was that we can do a lot to make our data analysis more powerful if we can visualize the data that invites our users to really think about it. And that means more than just infographics and making pretty factoids, but drawing the whole spreadsheet forward and onto the paper. The second keynote came from Ken Berger. He spoke, he's the CEO of Charity Navigator, And his question, his take on talking data was, what kind of data do we need to make sense of an organization? He used the example of a tricycle, which I find extremely useful as a mnemonic, and so I'm going to share that with you now. The 3 wheels represent 3 categories of information that he thought were crucial to any effective report. One is the results of the organization, the other is the governance of the organization, and the third is the financial stability of the organization. The front wheel of the charity is, the front wheel of the tricycle is by far the biggest. It is the power, it is the steering, it is the lead. It points the charity where it needs to go. And that wheel is the results. So in any report we write, we want the results, or Ken wants us to make sure the results lead the report and constitute the largest amount of time and space on the report. But the back 2 wheels can't be overlooked because they're the stability. Without them, the results can't be steered. They go away, the front wheel tips over, falls apart, can't be steered. So the back 2 wheels are the stability. And so every report also has to address the financial issues, address the governance issues of the organization, but should not dominate the analysis of the organization or the analysis of the program. Ken Berger, after his keynote, wrote a blog on this, and the link to it is also attached below. The last thing I want to talk to you about is findings from the SIAA Challenge. This is an event we organized in the months leading up to the conference. We had a whole bunch of teams from around the world. We had South America, Europe, US, and write a report based on the same data from the same charity. And this was to try and understand, when we go about reporting on a charity's results, how do we make choices about what gets in the report, what stays out of the report, and what's important? I think what's instantly apparent from looking at 6, this is 6 of the 7 that's submitted, is how different the different professionals, all professionals in the field, what a different take they had on how to write a report based on a charity's performance. Speaking to a group of evaluators, I wanted to pick 2 things to emphasize from this report. One was the challenge of writing to a general purpose audience. So I'm going to go from the top down to the bottom. The one at the top won, and the judges of this contest felt that it was high in substance, effectively conveyed the important parts of the organization, and was readable for many different stakeholders. So it would be useful for our managers, it would be useful for board members, and social workers that work in the organization, although given this organization's particular beneficiaries, it would probably be too advanced for them. The second report was considered a great report for sort of a donor on the street kind of person, and perhaps for some of the residents in this housing charity, but just didn't have enough substance for a typical user. The third report I'm now talking about, that it has the huge wide table at the bottom, was considered too technical for even most of the managers in the organization, even though it was evaluated quite highly for its analysis. And the last report was considered opaque for basically everybody. What I want to point out here is that the thing that seems to vary most in these reports, the thing that the number 1 report seemed to have, was not shortness, but really simple language. So they allowed that. I don't know if you guys are familiar with how to do calculate your reading ease, but there's online websites. You could just Google reading ease and plug in an amount of text, and there's a whole bunch of different algorithms that will tell you how complicated your writing is based on average word per sentence, average syllable per word, length of word, etc. And a 60 out of 100 is pretty easy. That's like a grade 4 or 5 reading level. Whereas if the 36 out of 100 is postgraduate reading level. So what made the top report accessible for a wide variety of stakeholders was not the complexity of the analysis, but the simplicity of the language. And I thought that was useful. So I'll leave that point there and go on to the next point, which is understanding how we pick information to go in a report. What I've now learned from the different reports that came forward is that people were deciding what goes in a report at 3 different levels. And the top level, what I call category level materiality, is this question of what is performance, what is high performance in the case of this charity. And then the next thing is what data should we consider to evaluate that category. And that's not in setting up the evaluation, that's within presenting the report. The point I want to emphasize here, without getting into this too much, we can is that every single group that wrote a report claimed that they were judging what is performance in this context within an EMIC framework. So saying that means, like, I think you guys probably know the terms EMIC and EDIC, but EMIC is applying a framework that comes from the charity itself as opposed to imposing an external framework. And every group claimed that they were using an EMIC framework. They had analyzed the data, they looked at the charity's mission, they looked at the charity's vision, they looked at the charity's theory of change, and from that they were now presenting their performance report. Every single group had different categories of performance, so that even though claiming it was EMIC, there was often kind of an interpretive or assessment that went on top of that. Whoops, I seem to have lost a slide, but one of the people who participated commented afterwards. They said, the data that we were given about this charity seemed really realistic. There was a good amount of data, but it had too much data on stuff that didn't matter and not enough data on the stuff that did matter. There was a real desire among the group participants to go back and revisit data collection. So that's what the person who participated in this SIAA challenge said, that they wanted to go back and revisit data collection after reading this. The charity, the report, for everything that, how do I want to say this? I think objectively the report was complete, and that the desire to go back and reevaluate data was triggered by some kind of interpretive or personal assessment of what categories constitute performance. And so I think for me that was a really interesting takeaway, because I know as an impact analyst, when I was working in that field, I would always look at a charity's work and say, okay, we got to go back to the beginning on this. What is your mission? How are we going to structure your data gathering so you're getting the information that we need to answer the questions that are important to you? And from studying the submissions from the SIAA challenge, I now think, wow, maybe a lot of that came from me as an analyst, and perhaps I should have worked harder to stay within the EMIC frame of the charity. Perhaps the data we needed was there. So I can take more questions on those 3 points, just to highlight and go back quickly. We talked about data visualization, pulling together a whole data set. We talked about 3 key elements in every report and some takeaways from the SIAA challenge. So I'm happy to talk about any of those in the question period. And now I'm going to pass to Anshula.
Great. Thank you, Kate. So actually that's a really great segue into the issue of standards and big data. So, and actually, if I just take a step back and talk a little bit about the conference theme, so talking data, to me that was actually a very indicative title for the conference, because it really spoke to where we are with impact measurement today versus, you know, really at the beginning of impact analysis, there wasn't enough data to really start talking about how do we present it. And ultimately, when we look at the speakers and the presentations that took place during the conference, a lot of them were around best practices for, you know, once you have the data, now how do we actually make it meaningful? There's a quote that I like that's not specific to impact analysis or evaluation, but I think speaks to the challenge that we're facing now, and it's something along the lines of you can have data without information, but you can't have information without data. So this really applies to standards as well. When we look at why standards are being created, there's a lot of benefits, hypothetically speaking, to having a taxonomy with specific outcomes indicators, what I call adjustments, which other users of SROI might call identifying outcomes to impact or deadweight attribution. And I've been told to speak louder. Hopefully that's better. Please let me know if you can't hear me. But just to kind of recap, when we're talking, when we're discussing standards and how to create them, previous discussions around standardization have been around how to create a shared taxonomy. So a very rigid set of measures that we can apply to a particular program and, in fact, apply across programs. And so for me, one of the big learnings coming out of the conference was that this is really not how organizations well, it's not the end-all and be-all of approaches to standardization. Specifically, when we look at, Kate, if you could just move on to the next slide. When we look at more technology-enabled approaches, and this is going off of a talk by Adrian Hornsby, who's the head of research at Investing for Good. Just as background, Investing for Good is a social investment intermediary and consultancy. Adrian's talk really discussed how we can start using technology to have a different approach to standardization. So currently, a lot of impact data lives in what I would call a static medium. So it's either completely paper-based or it's generally Excel or Word. And we don't necessarily have to accept that set of tools as the only tools that we can use. There is a set of web-based tools that we can use, and it's not necessarily using a particular service provider, but more around taking data that lives in an Excel spreadsheet and making it available either through Google Documents or some other kind of cloud-based system. The reason that's important and something that I think the sector needs to change its thinking about is that if we can get information into the cloud, we can start pooling data. And I think what we'll find, and Adrian's talk also discussed this, is that there's a huge variety, and no surprises, there's a huge variety on the types of taxonomies that people are applying to their framework. So whether that's IRIS, which is an international framework, or something very specific, either New Philanthropy Capital's standards, or something that was created for a particular collective impact approach. It's not that we're converging on exactly which rigid measures should be standard. On the other hand, what we can talk about is commonalities at a meta level. So if we were to go one level up and start talking about particular approaches to poverty and allow for diversity at the actual measurement level, that look at several different products or projects and say, these set of measures are poverty related. We can start pooling the data into a meaningful approach to standardization. So really creating standards that are based on previous impact measurement frameworks and moving forward towards a convergence based on previously done data. That's a very different approach from what we've seen in the past. Usually we have advisory groups that come together. Anyone who's familiar with IRIS will know that IRIS has a set of advisory groups for particular areas of their taxonomy. It is a little bit top-down. It's a great start, but if we are to leverage our technology a little bit better, I do think that there's, or at least I left the conference thinking that there was a very cool new way to approach this that can really help us break through the barrier of, you're looking at a slightly different indicator from me, so therefore we cannot share information. So that being said, Kate, if you could just move on to the next slide. Thank you. The other big question around standards is being able to create standards that motivate certain behaviors. So instead of just having a taxonomy that can be applied to everything, the real question is what behaviors are we trying to change? So going back to the SIAA challenge and looking at the reports, one of the major areas, and Kate, feel free to jump in with any comments you have on this, but one of the areas that was interesting to me when looking at those reports was that some of them didn't identify exactly who the report was supposed to influence. And by not doing that, there becomes a question of, what is the purpose of this reporting at all? It also becomes very difficult to start talking about materiality and that you're not actually able to change behaviors of a group that you haven't identified. So when we look at standardization, one of the key questions that have now started to come up is, instead of coming up with a taxonomy that can be applied everywhere, what is a specific group that we're trying to influence, and what kind of information would actually be useful to them? So that being said, there's a few different projects that came up and a few different trajectories for future standardization projects. Obviously, this is something that will be ongoing over the next 2 years before we see any real convergence. But the three that I just want to talk about was one, a youth impact measurement project, which is currently in a very nascent stage. Tris Lumley from the UK is also involved in that project. And essentially, it's starting to come up with common measures. It is a little bit more of the traditional approach of coming up with common measures and taxonomies that can be applied. However, this is a very large stakeholder group. Anyone working in youth impact measurement, we're happy to share contact information if you'd like to learn more from Tris or here in Canada. Secondly, there's a convergence on methodology. So there was a group that presented called ORS Impact, and they worked on just identifying theories of change for their clients. What was interesting is that the methodology that they're using was starting to, although it wasn't specific to social return on investment, there was commonalities between how we would approach a theory of change, even from an SROI perspective or more of an outcomes-based methodology. So the idea of standardization is complex. What I'm trying to get at here is that there's more diversity in what standardization means. It's not just measures and the taxonomy, but actually methodologies and principles. Of course, for anyone familiar with SROI, you might be aware that there are 7 principles behind the methodology. Those are ones that are adopted also by the Social Impact Analyst Association, but there is some debate on what those principles look like, and I think we'll see perhaps different principles coming out, but also a little bit of more adherence. It's kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back when it comes to principles, but the point here is that the debate is alive and well. Thirdly, the technology-based approaches to standardization. This is an area of huge interest, generally speaking, as more and more organizations start thinking about how to talk data, how to use data. The use of big data in particular has a lot of possibilities. Kate, did you have anything to add?
No, I thought that was great, Anshula. Thank you.
Okay, great.
So, Christy, back to you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful food for thought. Jumping back, we're asking folks to please enter your questions in through the chat box, or if you haven't yet checked in, that would be a great thing to do now too through the chat box. We can also, at this point, for the question and answer portion of the call, unmute lines one at a time if you'd like to ask your question verbally. So if you have joined by computer headset and you have a microphone, you can ask your question out loud. If you'd like to do so, just use the raise your hand function in the go-to control panel. I'll say your name out loud, I'll unmute your line, and you can go ahead and ask your question. But otherwise, please feel free to just type it into the chat box, and I can read it out loud for Anshula and Kate on your behalf. So we'll give you a couple of minutes now just to think of some questions, and if you want to ask it out loud, just remember to raise your hand in the go-to control panel. And I think that there was a question previously actually from Wendy, I believe. Yeah, Wendy was asking, what is the website with the Reading Ease tool that you used? And Kate, it looks like we can probably add a link to that resource in our follow-up email. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to share that link with you, Christy, and we can circulate it Also, I think a number of versions of Word have it built in that I can also see if there's a reading ease tool. I can give directions to that as well.
That's great. So I'm not seeing any hands raised quite yet. If you have a question, please type it into the chat box. And I don't know if any of you are on Twitter, but we've been actively tweeting. My colleague Zoe has been on the line and actively tweeting nuggets from today's presentation, so please have a look there too. And please add your own tweets as well.
I could ask some questions of the group.
Perfect.
I'd be interested to know if anyone knows any great data visualizations out there from the evaluation community that I could have a look at or share with others who ask about this.
If you'd like to respond, just raise your hand. I've got Stephanie here. Stephanie, I'm going to unmute your line. Stephanie Potter. Stephanie?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi. So I was actually just typing this in. I was going to ask you guys if the presenters, in terms of data visualization, have you used Inflow in terms of visualizing social network data, which can be helpful depending on what you're evaluating, collective impact and that kind of thing?
I can go first on that.
I have not used it, but
yeah, go ahead. I've used Cytoscape for social network analysis and just coming up with sociograms. Are you talking about sociograms when you talk about network visualizations?
I don't know the term sociogram, so there you go.
Generally, there's nodes and dyads.
Yeah.
Connects. Yes. Yeah. Great. I've used Cytoscape for that. I'm interested to actually hear about how you've used it. At SAM, we've used it to essentially we use a social return on investment, so we're able to calculate the SROI for individuals within a program, and then look at correlate that to the number of supports that they've created through their programming.
Oh, nice.
So I mean, it's actually kind of a side project that's been put in the first iteration of our software. Social network analysis was something that was actually front and center in it. I think it's a little bit, it was a little bit above what clients wanted at that time, so we actually put it on the back burner. But I do think there's a big connection between social networks and the ability to actually create impact. So, I mean, I'd love to hear about what your projects look like. That sounds, I'm all ears, actually.
Well, I'm going to disappoint you because I haven't actually used Inflow actively yet. It's been something that I keep intending to use, and similar to you, often clients aren't quite ready for it.
Yeah.
So that's why I was curious if anybody else had used it and to what extent. So, I mean, I have it, but I'll check out this Cytoscape as well.
Yeah, I mean, the reason we used Cytoscape was that it was a good plugin. But I do think, I think there's a question of what's actually useful to the end user, and to me it was kind of like nerding out on something that was really, really cool. But
Yeah.
I mean, we should definitely connect because I'd love to just hear about what your plans are with it. I think there's a lot there, but it's just hard to communicate it to a client who's really just looking for key things. I mean, one of the metrics that we're able to come up with, and I'm just making up the number because I don't remember exactly, this was back in 2011, but we were able to say, for every new connection a beneficiary was able to create in their program, they experienced, I think it was like a 25% increase in their social return on investment for that one particular individual, which is kind of interesting. But again, it was a little bit over what the clients wanted, and I think it just confused them.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. There's a question here. I'd appreciate a bit more comment on the relationship between the use of standards and evaluation methods, which should allow for the evolution of the evaluation processes with the project. Kate, did you want to jump in? Or?
I might actually go back to Keith. I'm not sure I understand the question. I was reading it. So the relationship between the use of standards and evaluation methods. It seems broad, and then, no, please elaborate for us.
So Keith, if you can, that was a typed question into the chat box. Keith, if you can just elaborate a bit more, then we can come back to that. I did have a couple of comments here, just actually going back to the data visualization question. Mark Habaj says that he mentions here that Hans Rosling is kind of a rock star for animating data through visualization, and Eric Burlow has great software for displaying network data, better that he's seen with other software, and so both are also on the web. And in addition, it looks like Robin has also checked out Kumu.io, Kumu.io, for social network analysis, and it's nice because it's online. Although it's a bit buggy, she says. They have a responsive development team, though.
Yeah.
So, Keith,
I would highly recommend Gapminder as well. I mean, I know that's Hans Rosling's piece, but it's like an excellent piece of software. So.
Great. I haven't seen a second part to Keith's question yet, so maybe we can just jump to another while Keith is sending in that second part. So Katie McDonald says, I'm calling from Waterloo Region. I work in public health on substance misuse prevention. She's currently involved in a number of evaluations, one relating to their work with community partners on delaying the onset of alcohol use among youth. Oh, sorry, this is just the check-in. She's attending to the call to hear ideas for evaluation and reporting. Hi, Katie. Sorry, I thought that was a question here. Moving on to the next one.
Actually, I think I can comment on Keith. I'm not. I think I know and or understand what he's getting at.
Sure.
I think, Keith, please correct me if I'm wrong in this, but so you're asking for a comment on the relation between the use of standards and evaluation methods, which would allow for the evolution of the evaluation process. Again, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think perhaps trying to come up with a standardization process while undertaking an evaluation project can have benefits, and perhaps that's what Keith is asking about. To me, there is a clear connection. So in some of the projects, oh, here we go. Yes, okay, great. So there is always a little bit of a tension between capturing all of the value that a project has and then being able to standardize it. Standardization, as I mentioned, has a lot of benefits for social finance projects, for communicating those results to other stakeholders who might adhere to the same standards. So really, what is the balance? Particularly with developmental evaluation, which we know is a lot more fluid, standardization is even more complex and perhaps not even, it might actually be detrimental. So from my experience, and I think Adrian Hornsby was also getting at this in his talk, taking a kind of, for lack of a better term, a more of a free-for-all approach at the beginning of a project and setting scope, identifying stakeholders, coming up with very unique, customized measures for a project is a good way to make sure that you're actually capturing material information. But seeing that as a process that evolves with the project. So if there is some leeway between saying, okay, well, the information that we captured at the beginning of the project, not all of it will be useful throughout the lifespan of the project. So in the second period, if you're able to look at your previous measures and standardize them a little bit, that can be a good approach. And so to give you an example, when Sam works with the United Ways, which tend to be kind of larger, they might have multiple agencies, we exhaustively list all possible measures of the United Way to be able to capture the impact that they're having in partnership with their agencies. After that, we go through, after a certain period, we go through and actually identify which of those measures can be standardized into which standard, or if they're standard just within that portfolio. So if one agency is looking at the number of people employed and another agency is looking at the number of people employed part-time, is there a possibility to standardize amongst those? But generally, it means that you're going towards the lowest common denominator. So, I mean, it's a bit difficult to answer succinctly because it is a process that generally takes a few months. But you can, I think, strike a balance as long as you're aware of what the reporting requirements are coming out of the back end. I hope that makes sense.
I think we can move on. Keith says thank you. Yep.
Okay, great.
So moving on, we have a question from Jeff. He says, it seems to me that we usually fall back on the story plus data presentations because they are easy for the audience to understand on their own. How can you make a visual of the whole data set, like the one you showed, easily and understandable in a report?
I think that's a really excellent question, and I think it is exactly that is at the heart of trying to pursue data visualization, which we're hearing more and more about, and is sort of an ongoing question for which I don't know if there are any concrete answers. The story plus data divide, I think it's easy for audience to understand, but I think the other point there is that there's the psychology often thinks of humans having two modes of thinking. If you're familiar with like Kahneman's work, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, and Michel Calon, a sociologist, also understood the world this way, connecting our human brain. When we are listening to story, we are engaged intuitively, and also we have our more pro-social selves engaged. When we are engaged in numbers and calculations, a different part of ourself is engaged, and actually that part of ourself is more self-interested. So where I think this gets really important for people who are trying to affect positive social change is helping our readers engage with our data with their compassionate, pro-social, intuitive minds, as opposed to a chugging, hard, calculative mind. So the story data comes in part from it's easy to understand, it's easy to tell, but also I think it's rooted in psychology and sociology is the point I want to make there. In terms of how to make a complicated flow diagram like the one I illustrated intuitive in a report, I can only offer insights from what I've learned, for example, from the SIAA Challenge or some other readings I've had, which would be to, in the text that accompanies it, pull out those key points that would have been factoids otherwise. So note the thick line that goes from here to here, for example, and then spend some time talking about that, using as simple language as possible and allowing the word count to increase. What I think we're learning is that the word count isn't the thing that makes a report manageable, it's the complexity of the writing. So in the text, focus on a few key things, but accompany that with something more complex than just the factoids themselves, so that you draw the reader into the visualization and invite them to engage with that visualization in a way that perhaps goes beyond your report. With, I think, as Jeff is inferring from his question, the acknowledgement that some people won't do that, and then the text just needs to highlight a few key things about it. I know there's a ton of really experienced people on this call, so if anyone else would like to chime in on that, I'd be interested to hear other people's thoughts on how they've managed that in the past.
And if you're on a microphone or calling in by telephone, you can raise your hand and I can unmute your line if you'd like to comment on that. I think we have a question here from Bill Beatty. He writes, you mentioned 7 principles for theories of change and a debate about what they look like. He's wondering if there's a source to go to for a review of those.
Yes, actually. So the SROI network, which just recently merged with the Social Impact Analyst Association, should have that information available. But let me just very quickly, if you haven't already, actually, I would suggest checking out the SROI network website. It does have quite a bit of information about SROI. I'm just going to, into the chat box, send the web URL for that. The SROI network has a very clear set of principles, which would be listed in their guide, which you can get off of that website.
And we can send that out in the follow-up email after the call as well.
Okay, great.
So Keith had another question. He mentions evaluation methods such as developmental evaluation can involve an evolution of the evaluation process as the project proceeds. However, standards could be interpreted as constraints on the evolution of the evaluation. Would either of you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I'll speak to it first, and I'm sure Anshula will have something to add to what I have to say. But I think there are a number of ways to understand the word standard, and very few standards that exist are standards in all of these categories. So, for example, there are standards of evidence, which is how sure do we have to be before making a claim. So that wouldn't impact the developmental evaluation at all. That's a standard of evidence that a number of people could sign on to or agree with. I get very interested in reporting and disclosure standards. So that takes the emphasis off how data was gathered and what precisely the specific information that must be disclosed instead of a rigid taxonomy, but puts the focus on categories or types of information that ought to be disclosed to somebody based on certain principles. So that improves the reporting and transparency of an evaluation without affecting actually the mechanics of how the evaluation is done. There are, of course, methodology standards, and I think that is where there can be some where there's a constant trade-off between comparability and flexibility that all standards grapple with today. Anshula, would you like to add more to that?
Sure. Yeah, I think those are really good points, Kate. The real question in terms of constraints, I'm actually just going to focus on standard measures versus standards of evidence or reporting and disclosure. It is a constraint to be able to really limit the number of measures that are being applied. So what I found to be the pertinent question is, for whom are these reports being created, and what value will these standards have to them? So to give you a couple of examples, local donors often don't care that much about like global standards. They're much more interested in measures that speak to the needs of their particular community. So aligning with something like IRIS might not make sense. On the other hand, because of the move that Ontario Trillium Foundation has made towards aligning with the Canadian Wellbeing Index, the Canadian Index for Wellbeing, a lot of more provincial, or here in Ontario, a lot of local charities and nonprofits are starting to become interested in aligning with that particular standard. That makes sense for them, even if they have local donors, in that they can now speak a language that is in some ways being adopted at a very large scale within the province. On the other hand, some projects are just too small to require any kind of standardization. They might have a limited number of measures anyways because of the size and scope of their programs. So going through the process of standardizing 2 or 3 measures that will not be required by any standardizing body is just not necessary. So the constraints really need to be looked at in terms of who's going to be reading the report, and then you can really start coming up with a middle ground. The last thing I would add to that is it's not. I think sometimes people see standardization as a binary, so either you're standardized or you're not. What we found is that you can actually introduce a level of flexibility. So some measures are standard within your framework and others are not. Often when you're using a technology-based approach, you can then only pull out your standard measures for certain stakeholders who are reading your report, and then use the more nuanced measures that speak to a local audience or to your board of directors or another stakeholder separately. So I don't think you have to go for one or the other, but certainly if you are standardizing, there's a possibility that you're kind of losing granularity. So to give you an example, if we had number of part-time workers and then we were standardizing that to number of people employed as an indicator, if you switch to that latter one, you are losing granularity of the number of people who are part-time employed. You're kind of lumping them all together into one measure.
I think that brings us to the end of our question period. Keith just wrote thank you. So Anshula and Kate, thank you so much. I just wonder, do you have any closing or last comments before we jump into our closing announcements?
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We will send the call out as a recording in an email later this week. As I mentioned earlier, and included will be some of the links to resources that were mentioned in the webinar by Kate and Anshula, and also by some of you. Thank you for offering your questions and your comments. So, and we'll also include Anshula and Kate's contact information so that you might get in touch with them directly if you didn't get a chance to ask your question today in the webinar. So our next call should be taking place actually in March. Our next date has not yet been determined. We're working on our next speaker, but we will send an email update when the date is confirmed. And just to note, actually, my colleague Zoe Fleming, who has been on Twitter during the call today, she has just joined the Tamarack team as our new CCI community animator, and so she will be taking over these calls, convening these evaluation committee of practice calls going forward. So thank you, Zoe, and we'll include a note just to introduce Zoe to you in the next email as well. And Kate, if you can just actually flip over to the next slide, our last slide. It's just an overview of some of our upcoming events. We're quickly filling our events in Brampton, the one-day workshop with Sylvia, 2 on collective impact. Our Evaluating Community Impact workshop in Toronto will be taking place February 23rd to the 25th. And if you haven't yet attended this workshop, I would highly recommend that you register soon. It is filling quickly. And if you need more information, you can reach me at kirsty@tamarackcommunity.ca if you have any questions about any of these events. We hope to see you at one of them or more of them. So thanks everyone for being on the call, and I hope you have a wonderful week, and we'll chat to you later. Bye.